The bell above the door jingled, its sound swallowed by the low hum of conversation and the faint rustling of plastic bags. A cold gust of wind slipped inside as the door swung shut behind a man, his shoulders hunched against the chill. His boots, scuffed and worn, left faint prints of dirt on the spotless floor. He paused near the entrance, rubbing his hands together for warmth, before stepping forward. The warm air inside the store was a welcome relief, but the weight of curious and cautious glances made it harder to breathe. His coat, frayed at the edges, hung loosely on his frame. His jeans, faded and patched in places, barely clung to his thinning waist. He wasn't here to steal. He wasn't here to beg. He just needed something, anything to fill the aching emptiness in his stomach. He moved slowly, weaving between the shelves, his eyes scanning the rows of bread, canned beans, and instant noodles. His fingers twitched as he reached out, brushing against a loaf of bread before hesitating. He took a slow breath and pulled his hand back. Instead, he slipped his fingers into his pocket, fishing out a few crumpled bills. He smoothed them out, counting. Not much. Maybe enough for bread. Maybe a can of soup if he got lucky. A few feet away, the cashier leaned against the counter, eyeing him with thinly veiled suspicion. His name tag read Earl. His expression read something else, something that made the air feel heavy. The man grabbed the loaf of bread, holding it carefully like it might vanish if he wasn't gentle. Then he turned toward the canned goods, his stomach twisting as he calculated. Bread alone wouldn't be enough. Behind him, the store owner emerged from the back, his presence filling the small space with authority. A stout man with thick arms and an even thicker scowl, he barely glanced at the struggling man before shaking his head. "Can I help you with something?" The words weren't an offer. They were a challenge. The man swallowed, gripping the bread a little tighter. "Just need a moment," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The store owner folded his arms. "You buying or just wasting time?" Silence stretched between them. The other customers who had been pretending not to watch suddenly found the shelves in front of them very interesting. The man lowered his gaze, heart pounding. He wasn't sure what to say. The man shifted on his feet, gripping the loaf of bread a little tighter. His fingers trembled slightly, but he held firm. "I have some money," he said, his voice quiet but steady. The store owner, standing just a few feet away, let out a short, humorless chuckle. His thick arms remained crossed over his chest, his eyes narrowing. "Oh yeah?" he scoffed. "Let's see it." Slowly, the man reached into his pocket, pulling out the few crumpled bills he had left. He flattened them against his palm, smoothing out the creases. A couple of ones. A $5 bill that was nearly torn in half. Loose change clinked softly as he counted, his chest tightening with every coin. The owner leaned forward, eyes scanning the small pile of money. Then he smirked. "That ain't enough," he said, shaking his head. "Not even close." The man swallowed hard. "I just need a little help," he murmured. "I'll pay back whatever's missing. Just give me some time." The owner scoffed again, louder this time. "You think this is a soup kitchen?" he said, voice dripping with disdain. "I don't do credit. If you can't afford it, put it back and get out." The store felt smaller now, the air thick with discomfort. Other customers kept their heads down, pretending not to hear, but their silence was louder than words. The man clenched his jaw, staring at the bread in his hands. His stomach ached, a deep and hollow pain that never truly went away. He had been hoping, just this once, someone might understand. "Come on, man," he tried again, voice a little rougher now. "It's just a loaf of bread." The owner didn't let him finish. With a sharp movement, he snatched the bread from the man's hands and tossed it back onto the shelf. "I said, get out." The man blinked, his face heating with humiliation. He looked down at his empty hands, then back at the store owner, who stood firm, unmoving. For a moment he considered arguing, pleading. But the hard set of the owner's jaw told him it wouldn't matter. The man exhaled shakily and took a step back. No one in the store moved. The cashier cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably behind the counter. A woman in the back aisle turned away, pretending to examine a row of soup cans. The man nodded once, small, almost invisible, before turning toward the door. His steps were slow, his body heavy with exhaustion. Just as his fingers touched the handle, the bell above the door jingled again. Someone else had entered. The bell above the door jingled again, sharp and clear against the heavy silence. A gust of cold air swept into the store as a figure stepped inside, his boots clicking against the tile. The sound alone was enough to make people look up. Something about the way he moved, unhurried, deliberate, shifted the entire atmosphere. The poor man, still standing by the door, hesitated before glancing over his shoulder. The newcomer was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had seen more than its fair share of trouble. A layer of dust clung to his long coat, his boots scuffed from miles of walking. The shadow of a wide-brimmed hat covered his face, but even beneath it, his sharp, piercing eyes were impossible to ignore. The store owner straightened up instinctively, his expression shifting from smug to uncertain. The cashier, who had been watching the poor man with detached curiosity, now stood up a little straighter. Even the customers who had been pretending not to notice anything suddenly found themselves frozen in place. The stranger's gaze swept across the store, slow and calculating, taking in the scene before him. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to turn the tension in the air into something thick and uneasy. The poor man swallowed, gripping his coat as if to make himself smaller. The store owner, on the other hand, forced out a breath and crossed his arms again, regaining some of his confidence. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone lighter now, careful even. The stranger ignored the question. Instead, he turned his attention to the poor man by the door. His eyes lingered, taking in the worn-out clothes, the empty hands, the way the man's shoulders sagged with defeat. Then, slowly, he looked at the store owner. A beat of silence passed. "Something wrong here?" The stranger's voice was calm, steady, but there was something beneath it, something that made the question feel more like a warning. The store owner shifted, suddenly uncomfortable under the weight of the man's stare. "Just handling things," he said, forcing a chuckle. "Nothing to see here." The stranger didn't smile, didn't nod, just kept looking. The store owner cleared his throat and gestured vaguely at the poor man. "Guy was trying to buy food, didn't have enough money," he explained, his voice tight. "Had to ask him to leave." The stranger took a slow step forward. "Is that so?" The store owner swallowed. "Store policy." The stranger said nothing at first. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. He stepped up to the counter, peeled off a few crisp bills, and placed them down. "Then I'll pay for him." The store fell silent again. No one moved. The crisp bills sat on the counter, untouched. The store owner stared at them, then at the stranger, his jaw tightening. "You don't have to do that," he muttered. His tone had changed. Less confident, more uncertain. The stranger didn't reply. He just stood there, unmoving, his eyes steady and unreadable. The poor man, still lingering near the door, shifted on his feet. His fingers twitched at his sides, his face a mix of surprise and quiet gratitude. No one had ever done something like this for him before. The cashier glanced at the store owner, waiting for him to say something, to make a decision. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Finally, the owner scoffed and shook his head. "Look," he said, forcing a chuckle, "I don't want any trouble, but this isn't about the money. It's about policy. If I make exceptions, then—" The stranger tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words. Then slowly he reached out and pushed the money closer to the owner. "Your policy," he said, his voice calm but firm, "is bad business." A flicker of irritation crossed the store owner's face. "Excuse me?" he said, straightening his shoulders. The stranger didn't flinch. "I said bad business." He gestured subtly toward the other customers, who were all watching the exchange with rapt attention. People remember how they're treated. You turn a man away for a loaf of bread, they don't forget that. They don't come back. A few customers looked down, avoiding eye contact. But they knew he was right. The owner huffed, running a hand over his face. "Look, mister, I don't know who you think you are, but—" The stranger took a step closer. Not threatening, not aggressive, just enough to remind the owner that he wasn't backing down. The air in the store seemed to shift. The owner's confidence, so strong just minutes ago, was beginning to crack under the weight of those piercing eyes. The poor man, still watching from the doorway, felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. Hope. A moment passed, then another. Finally, with a sharp exhale, the store owner threw up his hands. "Fine," he grumbled, grabbing the money off the counter. "Whatever. He can take the damn bread." The tension in the room deflated just slightly. The stranger gave a small, satisfied nod, then turned toward the poor man. "Go ahead," he said simply. The man hesitated as if unsure this was real. Then, slowly he stepped forward, reaching for the loaf of bread. His hands were steady now, his heart pounding for a different reason. He turned back to the stranger, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." The stranger nodded once. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. The poor man clutched the loaf of bread to his chest, his fingers pressing into the plastic wrapping, as if he feared it might disappear. His eyes lingered on the stranger, still trying to grasp what had just happened. The store was silent, the air thick with something unspoken. No one dared to move as the stranger stepped toward the door, his long coat shifting with each measured step. The store owner huffed, stuffing the bills into the register with more force than necessary. "You think you did something noble?" he muttered under his breath. "People like him just keep coming back if you give him a handout." The stranger paused just as he reached the door. For a second, it seemed like he might ignore the comment. But then, he turned, his gaze steady and unreadable. "You call feeding a hungry man a handout?" His voice was low, quiet, but there was an edge to it, sharp enough to cut through the store owner's feigned indifference. The owner shifted uncomfortably, but held his ground. "I run a business," he said stiffly. "I can't just give things away." The stranger studied him for a long moment. Then, with the smallest of smirks, he tipped his head slightly. "You just lost more than a few dollars today," he said. The owner frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The stranger turned his attention to the other customers, each one still frozen in place, their gazes flickering between the two men. Some looked away when he met their eyes, but others didn't. "They saw how you treated him," the stranger said simply, nodding toward the poor man. "They won't forget it." A few of the customers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. One woman by the dairy section quietly placed her basket down. Another man, standing near the cash register, hesitated before sliding his wallet back into his pocket. The store owner's jaw tightened as he noticed the small, subtle movements around him. The stranger pushed open the door, another gust of cold air sweeping into the store. The bell jingled again, soft but final. Before stepping outside, he glanced once more at the poor man. "Take care of yourself," he said. The man nodded, his throat too tight for words. And then, just like that, the stranger was gone. The door swung shut behind him, the sound echoing through the store. For a long moment no one moved. The store owner exhaled sharply, shaking his head and muttering something under his breath as he turned away. But the damage was already done. One by one, customers silently placed their items back on the shelves. A couple walked toward the exit without purchasing anything. The cashier, who had remained silent the entire time, avoided looking at his boss as he slowly reached for a cloth and began wiping the counter as if scrubbing away something unseen. The poor man stood there, still holding the bread. He wasn't sure what to do next. All he knew was that something had shifted. And he wasn't the only one who felt it. The poor man stood frozen in place, the loaf of bread clutched tightly in his hands. The stranger was gone, but the effect of his presence still lingered, like a storm that had passed but left the air thick with something unshaken. The store owner huffed, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath, slamming the cash register shut. His face was red, a mix of embarrassment and frustration. He looked around, his eyes darting from customer to customer, as if daring someone to challenge him. But no one did. They didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than words. One by one, people started walking toward the exit. A woman who had been holding a carton of milk set it down carefully, glancing at the poor man before giving the owner a hard look and leaving. A man with a basket full of groceries sighed, shook his head, and walked out. The owner's frustration deepened. "Oh, come on," he scoffed. "What, now I'm the bad guy? He didn't have the money. What was I supposed to do?" No one answered. The cashier, who had been working there for years, swallowed hard and looked down at the counter. He had seen his boss act like this before, but today was different. Today, people were watching. The owner exhaled sharply and turned toward the poor man, his voice tight. "You got what you wanted," he snapped. "Now get out." The poor man flinched at the words. His fingers curled around the bread, his grip tightening, but he didn't move right away. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. People had seen him, someone had stood up for him. And that feeling was stronger than any insult thrown his way. Without a word, he nodded once, turned and walked toward the door. The bell jingled softly as he stepped outside, the cold air hitting his face, but this time, he barely felt it. The door shut behind him, but through the glass, he could still see the store. Customers were still leaving, the owner was still fuming, and the cashier, he was just standing there, staring at the register as if questioning everything. The poor man took a deep breath. It wasn't just about a loaf of bread, it was about dignity. And someone had given that back to him today. He glanced down the street, eyes scanning the sidewalks, hoping, just for a moment, that he might catch a glimpse of the stranger. But he was gone. The poor man stood there for a while, gripping the bread in his hands. Then slowly, he turned and walked away. A strange sense of warmth settling in his chest despite the cold. Somewhere, out there, a man who didn't even know his name had changed something inside him. And that was something he would never forget.